Hi friends, my name is Emily. I am going to be filming a reading wrap-up for May, June, and July. I am going to refer to my bullet journal. I did do a May 2020 reading wrap-up. It ended with The Knife of Never Letting Go by Patrick Ness. I will link it above. I filmed it early and squeaked in Cinder by Marissa Meyer. This is a sci-fi retelling of fairy tale characters. So Cinder is a cyborg. I mean, it's been a while and I don't remember much. I had higher hopes for this book just based on how hyped it was on BookTube several years ago. I picked the first 3 books up used and I ended up making it most of the way through Scarlet. I think I checked out at a certain point because I wasn't super interested, and then I started listening to the 3rd book, Cress, on audio, DNF'd both of them, and so I'm going to be unhauling this, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars because I was intrigued enough to continue on with the series, but then very quickly realized that it just wasn't something for me right now. Then we move on into June. June fell apart. And so I read 3 books in June. So the first one was Love Lives Here by Amanda Jette Knox on audio from my library. So this was something that was on my radar. It is a trans family narrative. Jette Knox is somebody who thought she was in a relationship with a man, and then when her daughter transitioned, they went to Pride. Shortly after that, her wife transitioned, and so she ended up sort of having an identity search moment where she was like, I guess I'm queer. Like, so it's kind of unique that their marriage stayed, that like the love that she has for her partner trumps their gender identity. It was a really good memoir, and I love Amanda Jette Knox Instagram. I started following her. Her posts are just a delight, and I gave that 5 out of 5 stars, and I would 100% recommend picking it up. I see a lot of new romance being recommended as like light, easy reads on the tables at work. I work for Indigo. I've heard about a lot of these new, diverse romance novels. So I picked up The Kiss Quotient by Helen Hoang. It's about Stella Lane, a 30-year-old badass woman with Asperger's. That is language from the text. She has a job as an economist that she loves, but no real friends or romantic life to speak of. And so to gain romantic experience, Stella hires an escort named Michael Fan, a gorgeous biracial guy who dreams of being a fashion designer. It starts out as a business exchange, but quickly becomes real. Things that I highlighted about this was very sexy, female pleasure focused, with a lot of discussion of consent. But again, most of the conflict of this book revolves around a lack of communication, like just a stupid lack of communication. And like I'm finding that common throughout a lot of these new romance books, is that if the people just said to each other like, hey, we're in this fake relationship, this is starting to feel really real to me, where are you at, so that I can either end this or we can negotiate what we actually want to do about our real feelings. Like if they just communicated, there would be no conflict in the book, and that conflict feels weak. Every time I encounter it, it doesn't feel like a real conflict, because if you're already in a contract, you're in a relationship that is business first, it's negotiated, you would think that you would already be comfortable communicating about the boundaries of that relationship. And like so many of these romance books that I've picked up are about these fake relationships that turn into real relationships, and the conflict is a failure to communicate after already doing what you like. I would personally find it more difficult to approach a stranger and be like, hey, can we negotiate a fake relationship, versus having like a friendship and a knowledge with a person and being like, hey, can we just quickly check in? Are we on the same page still? Like, you would think that the hard part has already been done. But anyways, so the Important thing to note here is that the author is an American with Vietnamese ancestry, and also she is on the autism spectrum, so own voices in terms of the protagonist. I also like that the romantic lead is Asian and sexy, because I feel like there's a significant lack of representation of Asian men as romantic leads. So it's nice seeing that the protagonist is Asian and like super fucking hot, super desirable, super sexy. Like, I would love to see this adapted to film. And this is the weird thing. I am more willing to accept like fluff and kind of weak conflict in film and television than I'm not in books. It's a flaw at my core. It was an audiobook that I borrowed from my library, and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. So the last book that I read in June was for the Red Room Book Club, which is a patron exclusive book club where we are reading Stephen King books and discussing them with live streams. You may notice that Joe Hill, not Stephen King. However, we finished up the first chapter of the Red Room Book Club with The Stand, which is Stephen King's post-apocalyptic plague novel. And The Fireman by Joe Hill is Stephen King's son, is often compared to it. This is his plague novel. This is about a sort of fantasy plague. It's like fantasy athlete's foot that results in like a body rash in golden black that looks like scales. Once you get the scale, you burst into flame, usually. And so this is about people, like a small colony of people who have escaped the authorities, who have gathered together to deal with the infected. This I loved so much more than The Stand. There were many parallel characters. Sometimes there was like a repetition with a difference, and that difference made all of the difference. Like Harper, who is kind of our Franny Goldsmith, whatever, Franny from The Stand. Harper is our pregnant female lead, and she is just so fucking badass compared to Franny. Like, she has this no-nonsense Mary Poppins, like, fuck you, I'm sticking to my guns that Franny lacks. I was kind of dreading picking this up because it was compared to The Stand, and I hate The Stand. I've given it 2 chances, it's not for me. It surprised me, and I loved it, and so I gave it 4 to 5 stars. This was a new buy for the Red Room Book Club, but I read it right away, so I'm happy. I'm happy I read this. Now we move on to July. The first book that I read was Gone, A Girl, a Violin, A Life Unstrung by Min Kim. So this is kind of a neat memoir. Min Kim is a professional violinist. She loves music, picked up the violin very early, and this chronicles the experience of her coming to finding her Stradivarius, which, if I guess you're into music, you know that these are super fancy pants, old violins that are fickle and sound like an absolute fucking nightmare to somebody who doesn't play the violin. Like the fact that she had to find the right $5,000 bow to go with her like multi-million thousand? I don't know. It was a super fucking expensive old ass violin that required like special handling because the wood glue is, it sounds like a nightmare. Basically, a Stradivarius sounds like you have taken on a forever toddler, and you have to care for the toddler because you are its parent. You can't let it like just get infected and run snot all over the place and never bathe it and never clothe it and like never teach it and tune it, right? Like, you can't let your toddler go wild or it'll die. It'll die. This violin will never grow up. It will only grow worse because it's fucking old. And apparently that's the appeal. That is apparently the appeal. There's gonna be like one musician in the comments who's like, oh no, the Stradivarius, all these old violins that are like built out of like wood that doesn't exist anymore because like they're hundreds of years old and the quality of tree was different when they were making these violins. I learned so much about violins. There's a part of me that feels like truly Is the sound that different to the untrained ear? Can anyone tell but the musician? But I digress. Min Kim's violin was stolen by a group of Romani people, and then the police end up like staking out the Romani people, and like in the meantime she ends up really depressed because her toddler violin was kidnapped, and like as any parent would be when their child is missing, she's grieving the loss of her violin. She can't play on anything else because it doesn't sound like her super special unicorn violin. She ends up losing like a lot of opportunities and career momentum because she just can't play on any other instrument. She sort of settles for a different, rarer, less shitty Stradivarius, and it's not the same, and she still doesn't have a career. And then they find her violin, but the deal she made for her new Stradivarius means that she can't afford her original violin, and so she ends up selling it to like a collector, or like I'm picturing some like hipster like shit musician who ends up buying like her Stradivarius. She knows that like he's not a real musician, but that like one day it will fall into the hands of another musician again, and she finds a different violin that's not a Strad, and it's great. So like part of it is just me being like 100% baffled by the obsession with this what sounds like really old junky violin. Like her like loving descriptions of babying this violin, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on the whole kit and caboodle that goes with the violin, the bow, the upkeep, etc. Like there are only certain people who are qualified to maintain these old violins, and like I can't imagine having an instrument worth like more than a house. Like she would literally carry around this violin all the time because it was so expensive that you couldn't chance leaving it somewhere. I enjoyed sort of getting a glimpse into this world, and I can admit that I fully don't understand it. Like 100% fully don't understand it. That was a new buy. It was for the Wild Sounds Civilized podcast that I co-host with Bailey. We're sort of in this like weird limbo state right now because we're both so busy. She's a teacher and she's trying to transfer like what is school gonna look like in the fall, and right now I'm working, house hunting, trying to maintain this channel, so the podcast is sort of a little bit on the back burner for us, but this book was one of the things that we wanted to read and talk about. So I'm not sure I would recommend it. It's a very specific niche interest, I think, but if you're into memoirs, if you're into music, this might be something worth checking out. The next book that I read was Disappointment. That is Love Creekwood by Becky Albertalli. So I knew going in that this was going to be a collection of email exchanges, not a like story proper, that it was going to be sort of a loose epistolary novel following up with Simon, Blue, Abby, and Leah in their college relationships now that they've moved on from high school. I think 90% of this book is just, I miss you, Blue. I miss you, Simon. And then if it's not missing, it's Simon being like, sexual innuendos. I mean, this book is small, so for 90% of it to just be like, I miss you. Like, I would love to know more about what is going on in each of their lives, opposed to just how much they miss each other. Leah and Abby are not doing long distance. They are in fact roommates at university, and they're sort of skirting around telling each other that they love each other, and their emails were more satisfying to read. Just didn't do anything for me. And it's not the form. Like, I'm down with the email form. It's the content of the emails. This was a new buy, unfortunately, and I gave it 2 out of 5 stars. So the next book that I read was a graphic novel that has been on my list for a while, Through the Woods by Emily Carroll. So this is a horror graphic novel. How do I want to describe this? They're more like urban legends, like the scary stories to tell in the dark sort of vibes that get represented, and like the color palette. If you have watched my wrap-ups before, you know that my issue with graphic novels is if the illustrations don't capture me, what the fuck am I doing? Because it's just text then. And I loved the illustrations. I loved the color palettes. I thought this was gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous. And the stories themselves were just so creepy. This was such a joy to pick up after Love Creekwood, where I was so disappointed, to pick up something that, again, I was highly anticipating. Because like I was highly anticipating a Simon verse book of their life in college, epistolary novel of their life in college, and I expected it to be more about their life in college. I was excited for that. This was on my anticipated reads as well, and so it's lovely when an anticipation lives up, and this was gorgeous. It was so good, and I would love to look at what else Emily Carroll has illustrated to see if the color palette, like the choice here, I'm curious if a lot of her work falls into this aesthetic or if she works in sort of different color palettes, if that still appeals. I don't know, but I just loved this. Gives me Over the Garden Wall vibes. So if you've ever watched Over the Garden Wall, that sort of like creepy in the woods vibes, very similar vibes. If you liked Over the Garden Wall, you might like this, and vice versa. If you like Through the Woods and you kind of like that aesthetic, checking out the Over the Garden Wall TV miniseries, would recommend that. I mean, there are graphic novels for Over the Garden Wall as well. Haven't read those, but the TV show, good. Musical also. Through the Woods was a new buy, and it was a 5 out of 5 star read for me. The next book that I read was This Place, 150 Years Retold. So this is an Indigenous graphic novel anthology, and it looks at various points in Canadian history and tells the story from an Indigenous perspective. So it's fixing some of the things that like the textbooks might tell you, or that like Googling the Wikipedia of certain events might tell you, and framing it from an Indigenous perspective. I feel like it would be such a teachable tool. Like you could, except for the fact that it's super expensive and it would be really hard to get copies into classrooms, it could be a great teaching tool if you are teaching history, or if you're teaching English and you want to teach critical thinking. I will say that, as I just mentioned with Through the Woods, visuals very much matter to me, and because this is an anthology collection, I connected with the graphic choices of some artists over others. So each story was told by a different author, different illustrator, different colorist. Certain things I connected with, like I became very attached and engrossed in the stories that had very specific color stories. Like I tend to like limited color palettes, more fantasy color palettes. The more like true to life something is, like if it's just like a high saturation, real color, realistic people, I find it less appealing to look at rather than something highly stylized. So it was hit and miss for me, but I think overall the learning portion, because each story also started out with the author giving a little bit of historical context about what the story you were about to read was, and it also gave this like timeline of certain events so that you could see how this event farther back in history impacts something still either today or in the not so distant past. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars because of the teaching aspects of it and how accessible it makes this history, even though I personally didn't connect with all of the visuals. So the next book that I read was Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. So I recently watched Normal People by Sally Rooney. I read the book last summer, I believe, and didn't super love it, but I loved the show. I wanted more, and so I picked up Conversation with Friends, and I hear that it's a one or the other. Like, this is kind of a, we don't have Marmite in Canada, but people seem to describe this as a Marmite book. You either love it or hate it. And so I didn't love Normal People, and I can't quite say why, because the style is very similar. I did like Conversations with Friends. This is about Frances, who is a young bisexual woman who she's kind of a little bit of a dipshit. She is a spoken word poet that never writes anything down. Like, her ambition at the beginning of this book is to never have a job and to just make art and sort of float through life somehow. Her ex-girlfriend, still performance partner, doesn't write any of the poetry, but they're part of this performance duo. The relationship between them sounds kind of toxic. Their act earns them the attention of this older, more established journalist who wants to do like a photo shoot and talk about them and what they do. Bobby is a lesbian and she is crushing on Melissa, and the older woman who's writing the article, and Melissa has a husband. And Frances ends up fucking around with the husband. It kind of turns into a little bit of a mess. Like, this book, I feel like, also explores, just like Normal People, explores profound miscommunication. The assumptions that other humans can read our minds and will read our minds. We don't have to verbalize things with our partners because they know us so well, but then, oh god, I fucking hate my partner because they didn't read my mind, right? Like, it has that same conflict, yet it works so much better here, and I'm not sure why. I don't know if I'm just in a different space, that I'm more open to that sort of messiness, or like if this was just a right book at the right time. So yeah, Conversation with Friends was a new buy. I gave it 4 to 5 stars, and I found myself since doing a lot of Googling for like these, I think both of them fall into this dark academia space. Like, if you have read Normal People and Conversations with Friends and have any recommendations for books with similar vibes, please leave them down below. So then I started filming a clear up my currently reading shelf, which resulted in me actually updating my Goodreads shelf for the first time in a long time and discovering that I had like 31 books on the shelf. Wow. But these were 3 that I talked about in that aforementioned vlog that may or may not come out. And so just quickly, I finished Monster, She Wrote: The Women Who Pioneered Horror and Speculative Fiction by Lisa Kruger and Melanie R. Anderson. So this is a Quirk publication, and I noticed that Valancourt Books, which is a horror printing press that's looking at older texts, has 2 more books like in this sort of series coming out. So this was great because, as it says, it's women who pioneered horror and speculative fiction, so they're little snapshots of all of these women doing different things. And so what I ended up doing was coming up with, I have a little tabby in the back of authors that I now really want to check out. And so I ended up giving this 4 out of 5 stars. I mean, if you're also interested in learning more about women in horror, I would recommend checking this out. It's a great starting place to like expand that TBR, and so many things that I wouldn't consider horror, these authors consider horror. Daphne du Maurier is somebody that I sort of think of as like dark romantic literary fiction. They include her as horror. They recommended Don't Look Now, which I broke my rules about impulse buying and impulse bought because it was very cheap. So like certain authors that I wouldn't consider horror, or that the publishing industry doesn't sell as horror, they sell it as literary fiction, get included here. When I walk through our piddly horror section at work and I look for women writing, I don't see a lot of them. And I think it's largely in part because these authors don't get marketed as genre fiction, they get marketed as literary fiction. So I think particularly the back half of this book with a lot of contemporary authors was super helpful. The next book that I finished was Girls Resist, A Guide to Activism, Leadership, and Starting a Revolution by Kaylin Rich. Now I picked this up alongside Goblet of Fire for Lumos because I wanted to look at concrete, child-appropriate guide to activism and talk about the type of activism that Hermione is doing with the house elves and like where she goes wrong. I mean, following J.K. Rowling's statements, I sort of put Lumos on the back burner and did a lot of thinking about that series. I think this is pretty good. The definitions for a lot of terminology are explained really well for a 9 to 12 middle grade audience. The action plans, the brainstorming, like the thought process that you need to maybe do if you want to do good activism are all in here. If I were a teacher or a librarian at a school, I would definitely want a copy of this in like my classroom library or the library. Like, I think this could be a great resource for young people. And although it is targeted to girls, I do feel like the advice here would be good for anyone who wants to do activism. That came from my TBR and I gave it 3 out of 5 stars. So the last of these like 3 quickies for that vlog was the Big Book of Filth, 6,500 sex slang words and phrases, and I don't think this has an author. This just has a publisher, which is Castle, and the introduction is by Jonathan Green and cartoons by Kipper Williams. I think I heard about this in Word Slut. And so I ordered it used a long time ago and I finally started flicking through it and it's not quite what I wanted, which is my bad. I was hoping for more linguistic goodness opposed to, this is just a list. This is a list with like kind of weird illustrations. I don't like the illustrations. And I think what I wanted was fewer slang words, but more of a like, well, you say it comes from the 16th century. Tell me what literary text you saw this used in. Tell me about how this word was used before. Tell me about seeing that shift in the language from probably mundane object to sex object. Like where did that change in linguistics come from? Because you can't just bullshit like, yeah, it's the 16th century. There must be texts where that is. Like, so if the first known use of like, I don't know, fish to mean vagina comes from Shakespeare, like show me that quote, show me that like literary reference where I'm just bullshitting that, by the way. I wanted more context. I didn't want a list, and that's my bad. That's totally my bad for not doing my research. So I gave this 1 out of 5 stars, and this did come from my TBR. Then we move into the books that I read for the reading rush. So I managed to read 5 books during the reading rush. Only 2 of them were from my TBR. The rest of the TBRs sitting here unloved. The first book that I read during the reading rush was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo, and I borrowed this from the library on audio because I heard that Acevedo does the audiobook recording. Obviously this is a book, a YA book that is formally innovative. Acevedo is a poet. She's a slam poet, I believe. Those are her roots. And so to have her read her poetry, I thought would be more powerful than me reading her poetry. I do think I made the right choice in listening to the audiobook. This is the story of Xiomara, who is a aspiring poet, and her journey. It was just so good. She's a very strict religious family, and so like part of it is her exploring her sexuality, dating for the first time. It is beautiful. It is definitely worth the hype. So I gave that 5 out of 5 stars. The next book I borrowed from Libby, again, I just sort of had on my holds list as this like light fluff romantic interest read, and that is Fix Her Up by Tessa Bailey. So this is about Georgie, who is a 23-year-old party clown. She is the youngest in the family, who are all in this like house flipping, remodeling business, and they never take her seriously. And so she decides that to be taken seriously, she needs to have them view her as an adult. And so to have them view her as an adult, she decides that she needs to get laid. So she engages in this fake relationship with a former baseball player who was like her childhood crush, and I mean, it's one of those like fake dating turned real dating relationships. Things that I liked about it, I have two. Clear and enthusiastic consent and focus on female pleasure. Great. Number two is the Just Us League. So the women in Georgie's life, so Georgie, Rosie, her sister Bethany, form a Just Us League to support each other in their career endeavors, and my god, that is the reason why I picked up the second book, because I love badass ladies supporting each other in their career goals. Georgie wants to be an event planner, not just a party clown. Rosie wants to open a restaurant, and Bethany wants to do a goddamn flip. She wants to be given the opportunity to pick up the sledgehammer, to demo a house, to oversee a project, so that this family business has two teams flipping houses, can make twice the money. She doesn't just want to come in and paint and stage a house. Just Us League, 10 out of 10, the only reason that I picked up the sequel. Things I hate about the book. The fact that Travis, Georgie's lover, fake boyfriend, calls her baby girl. He's older than her because he's friends with her older brother, and he uses this infantilizing pet name in the relationship that's supposed to make her be taken seriously and like an adult. Just so gross. Number two is dangling Georgie's V-card. That Georgie is, of course, naturally a 23-year-old virgin, and Travis gets to deflower her because there's already this relationship, like this power imbalance. He's a famous baseball player, he's older than her, that he is also more experienced than her, just kind of like was an extra ick factor. Number three, Travis's second bat. Jesus Christ, that Travis's big old eggplant is brought up at every given opportunity, and that everyone knows about. Two bats, Travis. Number four is the dirty talk. Travis is into dirty talk, in which he degrades Georgie and reduces her to this like flesh bag. And I don't know if it's because I was listening to it on audiobook and having a narrator get really enthusiastic and like try and emulate like genuine dirty talk. Like every time he talked dirty, it made me like ugh. Like I physically like did this like awkward whenever I am experiencing anxiety, I tend to like do this with my hands. Like I have a lot of excess that I don't know, needs to happen when I'm anxious, and like I found myself listening to this book and just walking around like, ugh, like what is happening? Cringe dirty talk. Number five is the youth-friendly cover. Ta-da! This does not look like your stereotypical romance novel. This could easily fit into YA. I am all for young people reading about sex, exploring sexuality, and learning what healthy and not so healthy relationships look like. However, a large part of this book, it's clearly fantasy. It's escapist. I don't think anyone would actually want this type of relationship. Maybe it's just me. It's a kind of like power imbalanced, weird, a little bit possessive that I think is supposed to be sexy, but it's kind of gross. And like if young people pick it up because the cover looks youth friendly and this reinforces certain unhealthy ideas about what a relationship is supposed to be like, it just makes me feel a little icky. Number six, the idea that love will reform the bad boy. No. Travis is emotionally very stunted. He has been used in his parents' very messy divorce. He has very little stability, has no model relationships, has never had a relationship before, and based purely on his sexual chemistry with Georgie, magically turns over a new leaf and is suddenly able to commit and be a partner opposed to like an emotionally supportive partner opposed to just this fuckboy. And that Georgie sets out to change Travis. It's just not good. You cannot change people. They have to want to change. I refuse to give this a rating, and I borrowed it from the library as something like actually fun and amazing and so good and you need in your life. I finished The Midnight Robber by Nalo Hopkinson. I have already posted some discussion questions to my patrons because I announced this as like if anyone wanted to buddy read this with me during the reading rush, and I know some folks expressed an interest but then it took a while for their books to arrive, so I would love to discuss, and I'm hoping at some point in the future to do some filming around this. So this is the story of Tan, who is a 7-year-old child living on a Caribbean colonized planet in a place called Toussaint. Everyone here is a person of color because all of these people of color got together on a spaceship and they were like, fuck Earth, and they formed their own new colony free of European influences and systems. Technology has resulted in a lot of equality between people, and the technology is also this like governing body. Granny Nanny, the technology, is this AI that has taken on a godlike status. Like it's taught itself and learned so much that it's almost like the biblical god that like will strike people down. Tech is implanted in you the moment you're born, you're connected to the internet all the time. Tan's father does something impulsive and ends up being sent to New Halfway Tree, which is this like prison colony where people are sent to and they never come back from. Tan sneaks along with her father to the prison because she's 7 and she loves her father and she doesn't really understand what New Halfway Tree is. She sneaks along to this place that has no technology. They don't even have steel. It is a hard life. Everybody in this place is a criminal. And also, immediately once you pop into this new place, tech-free, where everybody's doing labor, you see heavy sexism increase and hierarchies around race increase. And so there is a race of lizard people on this planet who are very akin to indigenous populations with colonialism. And so these humans of Toussaint are sent to New Halfway Tree, and then they like immediately recreate the colonization and oppression and racism of Earth that they were escaping from in their ship when they went to Toussaint and built Toussaint. There's some interesting conversations to be had around colonialism and racism, and huge content warning for child sexual abuse and a quite graphic depiction of rape. If that is not something that you can handle, this was, there was quite a graphic moment in here, but so much going on here, so good. Had no idea where it was going. It was very literary. It's framed with this storytelling device. So in addition to being like sci-fi and like far future looking, it's also picking up on a lot of West African, African American, and Caribbean folklore. And so it's at the same time very forward looking and very rooted. 10 out of 10. Would recommend. I feel like if you don't like science fiction, you might like this because it is so just otherworldly with Toussaint and the New Halfway Tree that it almost feels like a fantasy more than a sci-fi. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. This has been on my TBR for way too long. The next book that I read was Sheets by Brenna Thumler. So I have been seeing this around on the internet a lot, and then I was just doing some shelving and tidying at work. We had a copy there and I was like, you know what, let's just pick this up, and I'm so glad I did because the story is cute. So this is about, well, it's not cute, it's good, it's meaty for 9 to 12 graphic novels. So it's about Marjorie Glatt, who is grieving the loss of her mother. Her mother drowned recently. Her mother opened this laundry business. They live in the house above the laundromat. Her father has fallen into a very deep depression. He's not working. He's not taking care of his 2 children. Marjorie's 13. The brother is in kindergarten, I think. Marjorie has taken on a lot. She is going to school and running the business before and after school so that her family can stay afloat. At the same time, this ghost named Wendell has recently died. He's got his sheet and he hops on the train out of the land of the dead, I guess, and ends up coming to this town where Marjorie is and finding the laundromat, and he wreaks some havoc on her business. I just think the color stories in this is so good. Like, the ghost world is very blue and gray, and it's lacking, like, it's a cool toned gray. It's a cool toned gray, a little bit of blue, and like it's very aesthetic. And then Marjorie's world is slightly closer to real life, but like soft and pastel-y. When Wendell is telling the story of his death, we get a switch in the color story and the illustration style again. It's just so well done, and I loved this so much that I started looking to see what else Brenna Thumler has done, because I wanted to see if like I could borrow anything else, and she's done an adaptation of Anne of Green Gables, that I'm curious about, because I love this sort of pastel-y aesthetic, and I like how cute her characters are. So this was great. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars, and like I said, this was a new buy. The last book I have here is Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reed. So I picked this up for the Reading Rush. This was the Reading Rush book club, and there is some controversy happening with the Reading Rush right now. I'm curious to see how that pans out, how Ariel and Raylene respond to this, because they did not read this book. They did not prioritize finishing this book, which kind of sucks, because this was one of the books that I prioritized finishing because I wanted to get in on the discussion. So this is the story of Amira, who is a 25-year-old babysitter who is about to lose out on her parents' insurance policy when she turns 26, and so she's thinking a lot about getting a real job, figuring out what she wants to do with her life so that she can get health coverage, because she's American, so she needs health coverage. She is accused of kidnapping her charge at a grocery store. I think it was a very timely pick given what is happening following Black Lives Matter in June. There were a lot of people just posting a black square and then just going back to normal. And I am very aware personally of that performative allyship and thinking about how I can actually and will actually keep actionable. So I feel like this was a good read for this specific moment, and unfortunately there wasn't a discussion for it. So I'm curious to see if in the upcoming weeks folks who did read it make more reviews, if there's some more discussion around it, because I read differently if I'm planning on hosting a discussion compared to if I am reading to participate in a discussion, if that makes sense. Like, a book that I'm currently reading and have to finish for the Patron live show in the beginning of August is Joyland, and so as I'm reading to host, I'm making notes about topics, things that I want to structure discussion around. I'm keeping track of those in the text, whereas this I was reading not to host but to participate, so I don't have a lot to say on it for that reason. I enjoyed this, and I could see this making a really great book club book because I feel like this book will benefit from discussion. I didn't rate Such a Fun Age. I gave Such a Fun Age 4 to 5 stars, and it was a new buy specifically for the Reading Rush. These are the books that I have read in the last little bit in June and July. How do I end these? Let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I would love to know if you have read any of these, if you have recommendations off any of these. I hope that you all are doing well. I hope that you have been enjoying the summer, that you are staying safe, that you are wearing a mask. Thank you to my patrons for supporting me throughout this mess of 2020. I have greatly enjoyed just having a small group of lovely humans who are excited to talk about things with me, like the comment section on videos. 50-50, hit and miss. Thank you, patrons. This is probably like hours of footage to edit now, so bye!